So we're getting more of a look at how the U.S. is going to respond to, first Israel's attack on the Iranian embassy in Damascus and then the Iranian response. So no sanctions or accountability for Israel. However, we are going to levy even more sanctions on Iran, apparently. Let's put this up on the screen. This is initially reported by Barak Ravid. Treasury to greenlight new Iran sanctions after Israel attack. If you read his report, he says Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen preparing fresh sanctions for Iran, vowing that the U.S. will not hesitate to inflict economic punishment in response to the Islamic Republic's unprecedented attack on Israel. He goes on to say why it matters. President Biden is urging Bibi to exercise military restraint, but in the economic sphere, the administration is demonstrating a willingness to retaliate against Iran. One of the things, obviously, that has absolutely enraged me in the discussion of this, Iran-Israel incredibly dangerous escalation is the attacks on Israel were described by many as, quote unquote, unprovoked, when, of course, they were not unprovoked. They were very directly, and by the way, very intentionally provoked by Netanyahu with that attack on the Iranian consular building in Damascus. So the U.S., to avoid having to condemn Israel over that attack on the embassy, which, is very clear-cut violation of the Vienna Conventions, violation of international law, just complete thwarting of all sorts of international norms. And by the way, makes our own embassy officials and consular employees less safe because it opens up this door to any state actor around the world. So to avoid condemning them, but also to avoid signing on to the notion that embassies are just like open season and fair game at this point, the administration has been playing this game of pretending like they don't really know whether or not this was actually an Iranian consular building. Matthew Miller was pressed on this by the incomparable Matt Lee. Let's take a listen to how that went down.
Have you guys decided yet or made a determination about whether what Israel hit in Damascus was a diplomatic facility or not?
We have not. We have not.
So how long is this going to take?
I can't answer that question. We're continuing to look into it. I don't have a timetable, but it's something
that
we
need to.
We need to gather enough information that will allow us to make an actual determination.
You have no one on the ground in Syria.
We have arranged,
overtly,
as I said to you when the last time you engaged with me on this question, we have a range of abilities, a range of ways to gather information. They're partner countries of ours who are on the ground. We have intelligence capabilities, obviously, and we're continuing to gather information, but we've not yet been able to make a determination.
I get it, but you were pretty quick into condemning the invasion of the Mexican embassy in Ecuador.
That was a very clear, well-established embassy.
And this is not very clear where they blew up.
This is something that is taking a little bit more time.
No one died in that incident.
That's not the question. The question was, was it an embassy or a consulate or not? And it was very clear.
How hard is it to figure that out?
In the case of the Mexican, it's something that we're gathering information
on. It's been like 2 weeks.
And we continue to gather information. We don't have a determination yet.
How hard is it to figure that out? I mean, the truth of the matter is, of course, they know the answer, because if it wasn't a consulate building or some sort of a diplomatic building, they would instantly have said so. But the fact that they're dragging their feet, we're doing an investigation, we promise we'll get back to you, tells you everything that you need to know, and is yet another instance of how they completely ignore or dispatch with any sort of the previous norms that they claim to care about when it comes to Israel. So no sanctions forthcoming on Israel for their incredible provocation here that any country would be, rightly outraged by, but they are going to apparently retaliate against Iran for responding to that provocation.
Yeah, this is the one thing that drives me absolutely crazy in the diplomatic conversations about these conflicts. It's that the sanctity of international law is obviously, and this is not new, but it is used as just a blunt force object and tossed around like a football, but it's not serious. And we know it's not serious. Matthew Miller knows it's not serious. Republican administrations and Democratic administrations know it's not serious. It's publicly very sanctimonious, but they know that they're using international law, that sort of shield of international law, as a tool, as a political weapon when it suits them, and then they drop it when it's inconvenient. And there are serious geopolitical implications for doing that, which is why they do it, in fact, actually. But I don't think that they've, even after all of these decades, reckoned with how seriously it hurts the credibility of the United States. And again, you can go back years, you can go back to the Cold War and have conversations about how we talk about international law in such, rarefied terms when it suits us, and then drop it when it doesn't. And this is a pretty clear-cut example, as Matt Lee was getting at, just there, Krystal, of us doing that.
Yeah, and it once again raises the question of how is any of this in our interests? Because, now our people who are at embassies around the world are less safe because we have allowed this door to be completely opened. And of course, the storming of the Mexican embassy, immediately after that is not an accident. And yes, we had something to say about that, but it was not nearly the condemnation that likely would have come without Israel's actions, because they know that they look like absolute hypocrites. And same thing with the language that was previously used about Ukraine, the humanitarian language about international law, about atrocities, about genocide even. Suddenly we don't hear anything about that because they know how hypocritical they sound, and how, when it comes to Israel, was it a war crime? Well, we don't know. We need to get a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. Who can really say? When it was Russia, they could say right away, and they knew right away what was going on. The other thing I wanted to mention about that Matt Miller interaction is that is such a classic tactic of, we're doing an investigation, but you never hear the results of these investigations, right? They never come. So, there was a investigation into the murder of the young girl Hind, who was assassinated. By the way, Washington Post has a new report on this. While she was in a car waiting for medics to come rescue her, also her would-be medic rescuers were also targeted and assassinated, even though they were coordinating directly with the IDF, deconflicted, giving them their coordinates, telling them, waited hours to respond, telling them where they moved. These investigations are apparently, launched by the State Department and never come to any sort of conclusion. Something else that, by the way, Matt Lee has pressed Matthew Miller on, all these variety of, massacres and alleged atrocities that supposedly they're looking into, that, we never get the results of those. We never hear anything more about it. And we just move on to the next outrage. Speaking of investigations into atrocities, the UN has been attempting to conduct an investigation into atrocities committed against Israelis on October 7th. And somewhat shockingly, I guess I shouldn't be completely surprised, but Israel has actually blocked and obstructed them, according to that UN panel, in their attempt to investigate the acts that occurred on October 7th. Let's put this up on the screen. So this is from the Jerusalem Post. They say UN Commission accuses Israel of obstructing an October 7th probe. One of the members of the commission said they saw active obstruction by Israel of our efforts to receive evidence from Israeli witnesses and victims. And I'll read you the quote from this individual, Chris Sadati. He says, "So far as the government of Israel is concerned, we've not only seen a lack of cooperation, but active obstruction of our efforts to receive evidence from Israeli witnesses and victims of the events that occurred in southern Israel." And he said, "We have contact with many, but we would like to have contact with more." The Israelis claim, they say, victims would never get any justice or the dignified treatment they deserve from the Commission of Inquiry and its members, which they describe as having a track record of anti-Semitic and anti-Israel statements. Obviously, the go-to anytime you want to smear someone and you don't like what they had to say about you in the past, just throw out that they must be anti-Semitic. But I think it's pretty extraordinary, Emily, that basically they've instructed witnesses and survivors inside of Israel not to cooperate with this investigation, not into Israel's actions now in the Gaza Strip, but into the atrocities that were committed by Hamas and other Islamic militant groups on October 7th. And Israel apparently doesn't want the details of that day to come out. I think there's a lot of logical conclusions as to why, or speculation that you could get into. One is that the Israeli IDF response was pathetic. You had many people who were desperately waiting for hours and hours for anyone to come and help them, and that help was not forthcoming. So that's a very unflattering light. And then we do have some of these instances, which have been documented by the New York Times and Haaretz and other outlets at this point, where some of the victims, not a majority, not all, I'm not trying to downplay the atrocities of Hamas on that day, but some of the victims did come from quote unquote friendly fire from the Israelis on that day. And I'm sure they don't want a light shown on that either.
And, this is one of the, I agree with both of those points. And one of the complicated things of the UN in this region is that, and I was talking to Ryan about this last week, it's absolutely true that in such a concentrated and densely populated area like Gaza, it's really like for the UN to operate for aid, for humanitarian aid, for geopolitical diplomacy, for all of that to happen, you're going to have crossover between the population that is supportive of Hamas, maybe even some active supporters of Hamas, and the UN and things like UNRWA, because Hamas is the de facto government. And so for that, from Israel's perspective, UNRWA does have some real problems where if you're Israel and you look at, for example, the much publicized textbooks, you're going to be like, oh my gosh, why would I want to, hand over all of this information, et cetera, et cetera. But it gets back to what we were just talking about, that countries like the United States and Israel will use the UN when it's convenient and not use the UN when it's not. And I think that is a real problem. So on the one hand, I totally understand in some cases why Israelis are like, this is the most sensitive information. This is, victims. This is people's lives, people's deaths, and we don't trust the UN right now because of some of these legitimately documented patterns at UNRWA, but and other parts of the UN. But that's not consistent with the approach towards the UN, and I think it is, in some ways more political. But it's an unfortunate situation all around, because what we do want are answers on what happened, about what happened on October 7th, that might make the Israeli government look pretty bad, or might make anybody, look pretty bad. And we can't get that information from an investigation in a way that we can trust, because nobody trusts the investigators. So we're not getting any closer to the truth. And what we really need is the truth, but we're not in a position to get it right now.
The Israelis are so funny when it comes to the UN, because, when it comes to the 1948 UN partition plan, that's set in stone, right? That's
it's the UN.
It was the UN, and they didn't listen to the UN. How could you, right?
Yes.
When it comes to this ceasefire resolution that just passed the UN Security Council, we're just going to pretend that didn't happen at all. We're not going to listen to that whatsoever. When it comes to the report that was issued regarding the rape in the context of October 7th. Well, that they were very happy to embrace. When it comes to this report, which they expect would shine an unflattering light on them in a variety of ways, well, we're not going to cooperate whatsoever, and we're going to claim that you're anti-Semitic, right? When it comes to Israel attacking the Iranian consulate, well, they don't want to hear what the UN has to say about that.
Right.
But when it comes to Iran responding, suddenly they want an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council to issue some sort of a condemnation. So it's just so incredibly naked. And then just the blanket calls of anti-Semitism at every turn are, I just don't think that they're landing, by the way, the same way that they once did. Because at this point, even Joe Biden has been smeared as like pro-Hamas. It's just ridiculous, the number of things that have been labeled anti-Semitic, pro-Hamas, pro-terrorist, et cetera. So it starts to fall on deaf ears. And that's a real loss, because anti-Semitism is a real problem. It is a real scourge. And when you casually throw around this language, anti-Semitism, blood libel, about accurately describing what's happening in Gaza, or about accurate or legitimate criticism of the Israeli government, the term becomes meaningless, and then it helps to fuel an actual, legitimate rise in anti-Semitism as well. It makes people more skeptical of that claim being made in every instance. Speaking of, some of the mythology around October 7th, that we know there were horrific atrocities. Those atrocities should be condemned by any decent person where they were committed against civilians. Yet we know there were some stories that were fabricated in order to serve as a real justification for barbarism against Palestinians in Gaza, the babies, the baby baked in the oven. We've got a new example of that, although this one got shot down almost immediately. Let's put this up on the screen. So you had a number of outlets reporting that among survivors from the Nova Music Festival, which was one of the worst scenes of carnage on October 7th, there was a claim made that there had been almost 50 suicides among those survivors. Now, this claim on its face seems fairly outrageous and outlandish, but a number of outlets, including the Daily Beast here, report this just uncritically. Well, this was so sort of out there of a claim, Emily, that it was almost immediately shot down, even by the Israeli health minister. Let's put this up on the screen. Head of the Israeli health ministry was asked about this and said directly that this was not true. He said, based on an examination conducted with the Nova Community Association, as well as with other parties, it emerged such data is unknown. But he also said directly that the rumors about number of suicides and hospitalizations are not true. So another attempt to, again, the atrocities on that day were enough. They were horrifying enough. But there's this constant desire to create the most horrifying, visual imagery and notion of what occurred on that day in an attempt very directly to justify things that are, even under the worst circumstances, not justifiable, being done against children and women and civilian infrastructure in the Gaza Strip.
This is, again, we're talking about the Jerusalem Post. It's not like this is, and this is where the health ministry pushed back on this. So it's not like this is just coming from, this pushback is just coming from the Israeli government either. Media is actually focusing on it. I think that's worth noting too, that there's, a real, again, I think thirst for the truth on these questions because, for Israelis, they're so sensitive, and rightfully so, about the truth and about what really happened and about the victims here. And so I feel like, actually, Krystal, it's interesting even to see places like the Jerusalem Post looking critically at claims like this, and as they should be, and as all of us should be. And this particular one, based on the health ministry, which I can't imagine, I'm trying to think of what reason they would have to sort of actively push back on this if it were plausible, if it were true. This narrative really had holes poked in it just about right away. And to your point earlier about how there's a lot more skepticism than maybe there was in the past. I think this really goes along with that with that argument. This totally confirms that, I think.
Well, and I don't want to lose sight of, as we talk about what might happen between Iran and Israel and the U.S. and sit here on the brink of potentially terrifying further escalation, all of which is still very much on the table. I don't want to lose sight of what continues to be the reality in Gaza, where you have millions of people continuing to starve. You have northern Gaza in famine. You had people that we covered yesterday trying to return to their homes in northern Gaza who were shot at. The very latest report out of Gaza is that you had 11 children who were killed as they were playing at a playground in Rafah. Rafah, of course, being the place where there is a planned invasion, where more than 1 million Palestinians have been pushed and are sheltering in abhorrent conditions at this point. So they had built this playground for the children to help take their mind off of the horrors and the trauma that they've all experienced. And they came under fire and were killed by Israelis. Let's take a listen to a little bit of this report from Al Jazeera.
We're looking at a very horrific attack that just took place at a Maghazi refugee camp within the past 45 minutes or so. And a drone fired the missiles on a group of people. Later on, we learned it from eyewitness in the area that this were a group of children at a playground that was set up near a camp for displaced families. And those children are regularly visiting this playground. And just as a father of 3 children, I understand why displaced families would send their kids just for an hour or a couple hours just to keep them entertained and release all the negative energy in them. Because right now, displaced families have the hardest time inside tents or inside other people's residential homes trying to stay protected and safe. But it's as necessary as also staying safe just to give space to those children. So 11 children have been killed in this attack. And just one wonder what threat these children had posed to have the Israeli military fire a missile drone on them. 11 reported killed, with dozens of injuries in the area. Those who at the scene of the attack describe horrific scenes of the children torn apart by the massive explosion caused by the missiles.
Just unimaginable. And Emily, I think the fact that there was starting to be more of a focus on both the humanitarian situation and the level of devastation and annihilation that has been, committed in the Gaza Strip, I think that's part of the reason for the timing of Israel's strike on the Iranian consulate was exactly to get these sorts of stories out of the news. There's starting to be, a little bit of different language being used, especially after the World Central Kitchen aid workers had been killed. That really struck to the heart of a lot of liberals who personally know Jose Andres. And, now a story such as this is not going to really get airtime much of anywhere, as everyone just focuses on, and understandably, the situation with Iran is very grave. We're obviously covering it here. But I think there was an intentional decision to try to push these stories out of the news and focus on something where Bibi felt he would be on stronger ground with the world community, and also to continue, his grip on power in Israel, where he's deeply unpopular.
Well, this brings us back to what we talked about earlier in the show in terms of U.S. funding for this war. I mean, you could even make the argument about funding for the war in Ukraine, that a lot of these decisions, by the way, I mean, this invasion of Rafah, apparently Netanyahu said he has a date, but our government said they weren't sharing it with them. Israel was keeping that date private. They weren't sharing it with the U.S. government. Apparently, they're afraid of leaks from the U.S. government, intel leaks from the U.S. government and from our intelligence community. That's what we heard. But the point is, this can spiral so quickly, and it can spiral on our dime without our oversight. Not that our oversight would be that much better, mind you, but that at least, people making decisions in the U.S., even if they don't care about the American people as much as they should and don't prioritize the real interests of the American people as much as they should, are responsive to the American public. And we're in a position right now, I think the attacks over the weekend really, and the attack in Damascus, really have brought that into focus. You guys have covered this, you and Soccer have covered this so excellently, how precarious the situation is right now. Let's not forget there are other adversaries that are aligned with this: Russia, Iran, China, all of the sort of recipes for a broader conflict. All of the necessary ingredients in that recipe of broader conflict are coming together. And I don't think anybody feels confident that the Biden administration or that Netanyahu are just firmly in control of of mitigating any potential explosions. In fact, what happened in Damascus underlines that probably for a lot of people, Krystal. We're in such a fragile geopolitical ecosystem right now.
Where Bibi knew he could take such an extraordinarily provocative and honestly outrageous act, and he could get away with it because he's gotten away with everything else. So yeah, Joe Biden, I mean, listen, Bibi has the lion's share of the blame. I would say Joe Biden is basically equally culpable for creating this incredibly dangerous situation, which is, something they claim to want to avoid from the beginning of this conflict. They claimed they wanted to avoid this broader war. Well, even without this direct Iranian escalation, we had already seen this conflict spread beyond Gaza. We're talking about Yemen, Iraq, Syria, our own troops coming under fire and in some instances being killed. So that cat is already out of the bag. Now what we're staring down is something even more terrifying, which, there was a report, I don't know if you saw this, Emily, and I don't know if this is true because it's from a news source that I'm not particularly familiar with, but there was this report that the Biden administration got in touch with Iran after the, Iranian attack on Israel and said, hey, how about you just let Israel respond, just like a little response, and don't do anything? Like, can you imagine another country asking us, like, hey, if they directly attack your country, could you just not really care about that? Would that be fine with you? And according to the report, which again, I don't know if this is accurate, but it was reported by a few different news sources. The Iranians were, of course, like, piss off. Like, no, we're not going to listen to you and just be fine if Israel directly attacks us back, after they were the ones, again, with this initial provocation, attacking our embassy and killing our people.
Yeah, it's weird. It's like, not that it's surprising, but it is, creepy and disturbing how reports suggest that there's this almost stage managing of the conflict and saying you're allowed to, the reports are with Iran, with Israel, you're allowed to do something, at this, like, that is proportional to this. And then they're allowed to do something that's proportional to that, as though this is going to totally mitigate the possibility of an explosion in this conflict, which, by the way, the safety of Israelis and Netanyahu's popularity in Israel, I think, speaks to this, or lack of popularity, or his difficulty with his political coalition speaks to this. Obviously, Israelis were not safer under Netanyahu because of October 7th. That's not to blame him for the actions of Hamas, but that is to say that he was in charge of the country, and there are a lot of serious questions that need to be asked about the security of the Israeli people on October 7th, on October 6th, before October 7th, and going forward as well. And, is he managing, is he prosecuting a war in a way that protects the people of Israel as much as they deserve to be protected? Are we doing that? Are we keeping American lives out of the Middle East? Are we minimizing the possibility of boots on the ground in the Middle East right now in our prosecution of this war and our funding of this war? Same thing goes for Ukraine. I don't think anybody has confidence that the answer to that question is yes.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll conclude with, and then we can move to other ways in which Congress, really has their eye on the ball with all of this, and the, I think the free speech moment on the right being officially dead and gone. But it brings me back to that quote that was leaked to an Israeli news station, where someone who was in the room said, if Israelis were privy to the conversations that are going on in the war cabinet right now about how to potentially respond to Iran, there would be 4 million Israelis rushing to the airport trying to get out of this country. So shows you some of the insanity that is at least being contemplated from the Israelis right now, and which obviously directly implicates all of us in a way that should leave us genuinely fearful and quite wary of where this is all headed.
In part because, by the way, there's similar insanity in Iran about what they want to happen to Israel. Like, that's why the threat is so acute and so real, because these are deep, religious, and in some ways irrational conflicts that you can't stage manage out of existence, and that there are like actual desires among some radicals to wipe Israel off the face of the earth in the way that Israel wants a one-state solution or something like that. There are also people like in Iran that don't want Israel to exist, and in fact don't want Jews to exist. So the possibility for something that jeopardizes the safety of Jews in Israel, of Jews around the world, is not nil. And obviously Netanyahu knows that. Obviously, supporters of Netanyahu know that. But whether the sort of bold, boisterous provocations are the best way to minimize that possibility is a open question at best.
Yeah, I don't really think it is an open question, but you're right to point to the fact that Bibi has wanted this war with Iran for a long time and was deeply opposed to any sort of improvement in diplomatic ties with the U.S., deeply opposed to the Iranian nuclear deal, as one example, sort of made the initial split and made support for Israel more partisan by coming here under Obama. So, there's a long and complicated, intense history there, no doubt about it.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.